When I was initially invited to this conference, I declined. I thought that this was a very powerful opportunity, but I thought that since I am not a Heschel scholar and I haven't known Heschel or his experience as a human rights peace activist, I didn't really belong here. And I must say that I am sorry that I let myself be persuaded against my better judgment. But now I'm here, and I am also a fighter, so I will try to say a few things about the subject of the panel. And I guess the theme of the panel that I thought would be divided between the three of us is still really not addressed. Because I think the question of the panel is, what do we learn from this fantastic, impressive, moving, exciting story of how Heschel worked in the United States and how he affected work in Argentina? We want to see what is relevant about all of this to a general struggle for human rights, and in particular, we are all interested in the very, very serious issues that we are facing now in Israel on both peace and human rights and politics and speaking truth to power and corruption and injustice and social solidarity and Jewish identity. Now, all of these questions, I think, we haven't really heard much about. And I really, I'm thinking as I'm talking to you, because I have a very, very complex argument to make. And it's probably a mistake, because it's probably too much, but I will do a skeletal general argument, and then I'll develop as I can. One of the fascinating things about what Heschel did in two different things, and the interview is also, he presented and worked and was a person who decided that not as a matter of civic virtue, but as a matter of Jewish identity, his role in the world was to respond to suffering. Suffering on an individual basis, but basically, and more importantly, suffering caused and facilitated by human society and social and political forces. And, as he said, religious forces as well. So this was his picture, not only of himself as a mensch, as a person, this was his picture of himself as a religious person and as a Jew. So all the things that we have been talking about this day and Heschel people struggle with, the question of the Jewish identity that is particular and a general humanistic identity that is universal, and the Jewish identity and how it is related to Christianity and maybe Islam, but also to other religions. I mean, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam cover a lot of humanity, but this is not the whole of humanity. There are many, many, many people and religions out there that are neither of these three. So what are we saying here about this tradition? And we talked about justice, about peace, and about human rights. Now, it's like motherhood and apple pie? Okay, yeah. Apple pie, motherly milk or something. These are all marvelous things, but they are very different things. Peace is very important. It's really in the infrastructure of everything. War is terrible. It's devastation, it's murder, it's destruction. It's really terrible. But we have just and unjust war. And even Heschel was delighted. I don't know what he said in 47, but in 67, we know he was delighted that there was a war and that Israel did not lose it. So it's not that all use of military power, even when innocent people are harmed, is unjustified. We need to be a bit more differential. And war is a matter of politics. War is not a matter of human rights. A matter of human rights within war, how to conduct war and things like that. But these are not the question of whether this is the right time to go to war is usually considered a paradigmatic question of politics, and human rights is supposed to be apolitical. Justice, too, poverty, all of these things are very, very important. It's not clear that they are defined as civil and human rights. Now, what is the power of human rights, the distinctive power of human rights? And I, in fact, originally, when I planned my talk, I didn't even want to talk about human rights in general. I wanted to only talk about racism as a paradigmatic violation of human rights. Now, human rights are the rights, the entitlements, the things that I don't have only because of my need or my wish or my interest. Human rights are the obligations on everyone else not to do a certain basic things to other individuals and groups. And human rights claim to be universal. They apply to all societies, democratic and not democratic, liberal and not liberal, and always. And human rights are not supposed to depend on majority vote. Human rights are the constraints of what government, individuals, and society can do to other people. And this is their fantastic moving power. Because it's not a matter of policy, it's not only a matter of need, it's a matter of my entitlement, my right, but my entitlement is your and my obligation. The obligation not to violate right. And the main right is the right to human dignity. And it can be derived from religion, because it can be derived from the fact that we are all born in the image of God. But in order for human rights to have the power that they are supposed to have, that they can override what particular societies think is right for them, in order for human rights to respect the pluralism of cultures and religions and states and communities, human rights must be very thin. It cannot be the case that everything good on earth is my human right. Because if everything good on earth is my human rights are everything, but then they're nothing. They can only be significant constraints on what power can do if they are thin. Now, American racism in the 60s was a clear violation of human rights. And it was an easy case. It was an easy case because there was no question of, is this an attempt to save the distinct identity of the white majority? Or is this, it was nothing, there was no threat. Blacks were allowed to work in America, they were allowed to fight and die for America, they were running and gaining medals for America, but they were transparent in every other way. This was terrible. And despite the fact that this was so obvious, such an easy case, the number of people who came up to protest was small. and the number of religious leaders who came up was even smaller. And some of the people who were white supremacists were also doing that by invoking religious principles. So this was a major act of courage and the promotion of human rights. Vietnam is different. I think the American war in Vietnam was wrong, but this is a political position. And as a political position, Heschel had every right, and other religious leaders, to fight against the war in Vietnam. But this is not a matter of human rights. And in fact, it was interesting to see that Heschel was worried and debated whether Luther King should come out against the war in Vietnam for fear that this would seem that he is becoming partisan and will dilute his human rights, I have a dream, equality argument that was the moving power of the human rights movement. Michael Walzer, we just heard, was of course for the civil rights movement, and he was also against the war in Vietnam, but he is very careful to say that one is a political struggle. We are invoking our rights to dissent, to freedom of speech, to freedom of protest, in order to sway our democratically elected authorities so that they will bring us peace. Because we cannot bring peace. We can campaign so that they will bring us peace. And this is politics. And this is what people involved in political struggle do. But human rights are not supposed to be the same thing. Human rights are supposed to be those claims that do not depend on what your partisan politics is. Human rights is supposed to depend on your humanity alone. So it's a critical interest of people who want to struggle for human rights and not for many other good things, to be very careful not to expand human rights more than the thin, shared, universal claim to something that is truly built on our being human alone. Now, this is the United States in the 60s. If we go to the United States now, we see that despite the fact that this was a very strong struggle and very successful struggle in many ways, there are no more laws saying that schools cannot admit blacks and things like that. Even today we heard that the series of black kids being shot down is there, and we know that there is the offense of driving or walking in the street while black or some other thing. We know that these are live issues in the United States, so the struggle against racism is an ongoing business. And I think Heschel, despite the very moving generalities that he was making, knew very well, A, that many people were tired and found many excuses not to fight the right thing. And he knew that you shouldn't relegate this to courts, which many, many people do nowadays, and that it's also very important to struggle against racism effectively. And if you want to struggle against racism effectively, you need to have a very sober analysis of what the problems are. And it's interesting to see why discrimination against Asians, that was at the height in the 20s and the 60s, was very, very strong in America, why you don't see that anymore at all. There are many cultural issues that relate to my second point. When Heschel did this marvelous thing, courageous, that was good for Jews and for Judaism, and created this role model for being engaged in the war for human rights, he didn't have to address some of the complexities that we already know exist for any human rights struggle and even for any struggle against racism. And some of these issues are very, very relevant to what we encounter in Israel today. And this started earlier, because Israel was founded in 48. Israel was founded as a Jewish state. That is, Israel was founded as a particular state, not as a neutral civic state committed to the equality of all its citizens. It was committed in the Declaration of Independence and in some of the arrangements to equality, but it rose in war against people who said that the Zionist campaign was colonialist, imperialist, and unjust. And there was a war there, and there was a debate about this war, whether this war was justified. And Israel was established in war as a state that was a state for one group of people, not for the whole citizens. Now, this is something that requires some elaboration and analysis. Are we for the creation of such states? And some people said that many people criticized Zionism and the moves to establishing a Jewish state as being inconsistent with morality and with equality. So this is not something new. The idea that Zionism was not only immoral, but was also a form of racism grew much more powerful in the 60s and 70s for a variety of reasons. A, because I think it was supposed to be very, very powerful for Jews to be accused of the very same thing that they were the victims of, and that in some senses justified to some people in some states their need to have a state of their own. And there was this general post-colonial third world move of expanding human rights to include quite a lot of political concerns that has been a problem with the human rights discourse all over the place. After the 73 war, Heschel is already dead by now. He couldn't foresee how long the occupation will last. There is this United Nations resolution of Zionism as a form of racism. And now we see that there is a growing Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, violence. In the Middle East is restructuring itself. The nation states of the Sykes-Picot era are collapsing, and what we are seeing is a region being restructured on the basis of identity groups that are religious and ethnic in an all-or-nothing exclusivist conceptions of how the world should be. Now this is, I think that the 60s in the United States is very mild to what we hear now every day happening in Iraq and Syria in terms of human rights and in terms of particularism versus universal humanity. Okay, so Israel in a way creates an issue for equality. By definition, it creates an issue for equality. And it's not only that. Israel creates an issue for equality because it's part of a region in which the people who argue against Israel, the Arabs primarily, do not want a neutral, liberal Western democracy. What they want is an Arab Islamic state with Jews maybe as tolerated minority, the way they have been for many, many years, if they don't want to, do harsher things to them. So what they want is Arabic or Muslim control over the territory. So we are talking about a region in which this rhetoric of universality, human rights, equality, civic states, Western democracy is something that is considered unclearly. And this is the situation in Israel now. In Israel, we have three types of issues that are connected to human rights. It has all the range of human rights issues that every country has, but it has other things that are related to its history and its essence. As I said, Israel, by its definition, is not supposed to be a country that only seeks to promote the welfare of all its citizens and residents. It is committed to doing that, but it's also committed to give the Jews the one place in the world in which they enjoy not only the freedom to have their religious, spiritual life and freedom of association, but also a territory in which they are a majority and in which the public culture gives them the right to self-determine and the obligation to deal with force, political force used by a Jewish majority to deal with the Jewish state. This is a unique form of Jewish existence that has not existed for generations. So this was the purpose of Zionism. And this, to some extent, is still the purpose of Zionism. I am not sure, and I don't want to go into the question of what would Heschel say to this idea of Zionism. But I think that in many of the terms of struggling with the implications to Israel today, I think that there are a few things that I think we can be sure that he would agree with, and a few things that I think he will be extremely concerned and worried about. And I will talk about only 4 of them. I think, first of all, Heschel would reject the argument that Zionism is a form of racism and that Jewish self-determination or the right or interest of Jews in maintaining a distinct community in part of their ancient homeland is illegitimate and a form of racism. I think he would reject that. I think I would go further and say that a person who rejects this right in the abstract is himself or herself racist, because he is saying that Jews as a people, as a group of whatever definition, Jews are one of the only groups claiming peoplehood that is not entitled to that kind of self-determination. I don't know if you know that the covenants of human rights, the covenant for civil and political rights and the covenant for social, economic, and cultural rights both open up with the section of the right of peoples to self-determination. This is not an invention of colonialists. This is the human rights discourse of the international community. So the tension between groups wanting self-determination and human rights on an individual level, the tension between these things is immanent to the human rights discourse itself. And this is another very important thing that I'm not sure Heschel really had to contend with. The second issue is that human rights as an ideal is an ideal with a lot of internal tensions, because human rights are many. The usual problem is the problem of freedom and equality. Freedom and equality are both very basic ideals. Liberalism, I think, is committed in a way to both. Democracy is clearly committed to some form of equality. But freedom and equality, in some very, very important ways, go in contradictory ways. Because if I let everyone have the freedom to do what they want, and if they have different tendencies, capabilities, diligence, then probably if I have a lot of generations of freedom, I will have quite a lot of inequality. It's more than that. If I allow individuals and groups to entertain preferences about their groupings, not only about their individual lives, about their community lives, then I am suggesting an internal tension between freedom of association and equality, between freedom of religion and equality. Say that I am a majority religion. I want to decide who is a member of my religion. Now, some people, because I'm the majority religion and it's beneficial to be the majority anything in most societies, they want to join the majority religion. So now there is a question, who decides if and who and how can join the majority religion? Now, who decides? It's an interesting question. You know, it's very, very hot in Israel at the moment. Who decides who can join the Jewish people? I don't know what Heschel would have said. Actually, I'm quite curious. But in any event, this is a particular decision that comes from the right of Jews to determine the identity of their religious tradition. Now, it's very, very difficult to be committed to human rights and to tell rabbis what they should decide on who can join the Jewish people. But on the other hand, it may be very, very disturbing if we let Orthodox rabbis decide that only people who fully observe can join the Jewish people. Because I am a Jew, I feel myself a Jew, I want to remain a Jew, I hope my children will be Jews, I want to live in the state in which Jews have self-determination, and I do not observe. Now, why can't a person who wants to be like me not be allowed to join the Jewish people today when a majority of Jews are like me? It's not a trivial question at all. But it's also not a trivial question in the sense that it's not a trivial human rights question, because it raises question of self-identity of people who want to join the Jewish people, but it also involves the right of Jews, the collective right of Jews as a community to control who can join the Jewish group. So human rights are not something trivial that there is always one right answer to what we should do at any particular moment. And the question then is, who decides? And I think here is the number 3 question that I want to address. I want to suggest that, yes, human rights are very important. Racism, the core case of racism, treating others as inferior and seeing them as inferior, and because of that to justify humiliating, discriminating, excluding, and even killing them, this is a paradigmatic violation of human rights. The Jewishness of the state, whether religious or national or cultural or historical, does not require and does not allow that kind of discrimination. But it's some other questions are much less clear. For instance, is it allowed in a state that is committed to equality to, I'm not talking about the legal arrangement of the religious monopoly of marriage and divorce, but let's say that we have the American system, legal system. People can marry the way they want. Is it going to be justified in a state like that for religious leaders to fight against assimilation by reasoning with their communities that they should only marry within the faith? Is this something that is part of the right of the Jews not to assimilate? Or is this an affront to the fact that we are all created in the image of God? And love does not know religions and colors. Okay, so I think this is a very important. Last point, 2 more. One is the relationship of Israel and the Arab minority in Israel and the Palestinians. Palestinians is primarily about peace and also about human rights. And I think that they need and should be distinguished But the peace is the central one, because the peace creates the absence of peace, the absence of agreement, creates this prolonged situation in which Israel controls the West Bank, but the population, the Palestinian population of the Bank is not citizens of Israel. So they do not enjoy the civil and political rights and the other rights enjoyed by Israelis, but nonetheless they are subject to Israeli control. Now, this situation will last as long as there is no political arrangement that will decide what is the political future of these territories. But nonetheless, I think the question of the political future of these territories is not a matter of human rights, it's a matter of politics. And I don't want to go into that, despite the fact that this is very interesting, maybe if you want in the Q&A. But the Arab minority within Israel is a different matter. They are citizens of Israel, they are entitled to civic equality, and the problem with this is, on one level, very, very simple. There is racism in Israel. There is racism in Israel not only versus Arabs, but also versus Ethiopian Jews and African immigrants and all that. There is this feeling that people who are different also in a way that justifies different treatment and worse treatment. So this exists, and we should fight this. And in a moment I'll say some more about how to fight this. But I think that we need to remember that the Arab minority in Israel, it's less simple. This is quite true, no problem at all. But there is a complicating feature which relates to the fact that there is an unresolved military conflict about the right of the country to exist, and in which some of the Arabs, not all of them, but some of their leaders, take positions that are not simply very proud national, religious, Muslim or Arab or Christian positions, which is legitimate and should be endorsed, although it's not always. They take positions about the illegitimacy of the state of Israel itself, and definitely about the illegitimacy, not only the bad implications de facto, but the in principle illegitimacy of the idea of Jewish self-determination. Now, I think that this makes things more complicated, because then the problem is not inferiority, superiority, we want to keep our privileges, blah, blah, blah. Then the question is a context of a fight for legitimacy and existence. I think that the Jewish majority is sufficiently strong to allow quite a lot of that and to contain quite a lot of that, and this is fine. The last thing that I think Heschel would want to say a lot about is about how to effectively struggle for human rights. And I think one of the things we learn from what I've said until now is that if we want to take human rights seriously, we must take care to make human rights as inclusive as it can be. If human rights becomes very partisan, this is not only going to make many, many things difficult, because ultimately the protection of human rights depends quite a lot to what political and social organizations do, and if you're working against the political and social organizations of your society, you're not likely to be very effective, because you're going to have a backlash of antagonism, etc. It's not only the practical parts of it, it's also the ideological part of it. Because if you want to take human rights seriously in the way that Heschel put it, the human rights that come from the fact that we are all human, despite our differences, despite our disagreements, despite our bitter and violent conflict, you must give this inclusivity a serious meaning. So you cannot claim constantly that people who don't see eye to eye with you are terrible fascists, non-humanists, and the scum of the earth. If you're saying that, you, in your language, you are telling them you're not partners. We have here a war of the good guys and the bad guys. And you, because you disagree with us, are the bad guys. Now, maybe I'm naive. Maybe it's impossible. Maybe Israeli society is so divided that it's impossible to do that and you need to fight for the good, even if the cost of fighting for the good is alienating everyone who disagrees with you. But I want here to go back to what we heard about Heschel on Jewish solidarity. Heschel, in a way, didn't belong anywhere, and because he didn't belong anywhere within Judaism, he felt that he could belong everywhere. He felt sufficiently secure to go to the Catholics, with large objection from some Jewish leaders who thought that it was the wrong thing to do, and he managed to get them to understand a very deep thing, that it's very, very bad if they want to base their relationship to the Jews on the messianic hope that all Jews will end up seeing the light and become Catholics. Now this is like Tinok Shenishba, if you know what I mean. I think the tendency of the Orthodox establishment in this country, including the liberal, to see all non-Orthodox people as Tinok Shenishba is the very bad way of trying to see that human rights is really a tradition that comes from Judaism. I believe deeply, this is my commitment to this country and to its success. I believe deeply that, yes, democracy and human rights are things that we share. There are many, 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 many things that we disagree on. Our success in our joint project, which is, for me now, the State of Israel, or in a larger perspective, the Jewish people, our success depends on our willingness to understand that we need to put the disagreements, to suspend them in order to strengthen and thicken the joint framework. Within Israel, the joint framework is human rights, Jewish people for Jews, and shared citizenship. For the Jewish people, the joint framework is the Jewish people. And this is all a part of our commitment to humanity at large. But we want to invest efforts in what to us seems critical now. And if we want the State of Israel and the Jewish people to succeed, I feel very deeply, and I think that on this, I'm sure that he would disagree with me on many of my political positions, but I think on this he would agree, that if we are not willing to suspend the disagreements and not learn from disagreeing on very important issues that this person is an enemy and not part of us, if we are not willing to make the inclusive frameworks of citizenship, Jewishness, humanity meaningful, and we are not willing to pay the price of that meaningful, which is letting go of some of the richness of the tradition and making it a bit thin so that many can live together within the same room, if we don't have the wisdom of doing that, then we are going to fail. Now, within the room, we need powers who will shout at us and be the prophets. But Jeremiah and Isaiah were prophets within a people, most of which was not very quick to run to the prophecy. And they were committed to this people, bad or good. And I think this is what the struggle for human rights means, the commitment to humanity with the understanding that we must work to improve humanity with the people with whom we live as they are. Thank you.